Hi, I'm Charlotte from Flower Child. I'm a quilter and a teacher, and I want to show you how I cut my patchwork squares. You'll need a cutting mat with 1-inch markings, a long quilting ruler, mine is 6 by 24 inch, a rotary cutter, some fabric, it can be a fat quarter bundle or anything you have. You'll need an iron, and maybe a small cutting ruler is really helpful but optional. First, open your fabric and we need to iron all the fabric. It doesn't have to be super perfect, just to get the main creases out. Work through your fabric, make sure it's nice and flat because we're going to stack them together. Next, layer up the fabrics, making sure the edges line up as best as you can. I'm going to be cutting 4 fabrics at a time. You might find that you want to do less, just experiment with what you feel comfortable with. Line the fabrics up as best as you can on the board, and I'm using the markings on the board to take off the selvedge edge. I'm always cutting away from myself just so that I'm comfortable. Now we have a nice straight edge to work from. Always adjust the mat so you're comfortable and not overreaching. I'm going to be cutting 5-inch squares, so I'm going to rotate the mat round so I can cut comfortably and safely. I'm going to be using the markings on my ruler now to cut my 5-inch squares. I know that first edge is straight, so I'm counting along my 5 inches. I'm lining up the markings on the ruler on the edge of my fabric. I'm now going to make my first cut, and I'm going to think about where my fingers are. Don't have them overhanging the ruler. Make sure you haven't got a digit sticking out. This probably seems really obvious, but just think about safety so you can use this really amazing tool without hurting yourself. Just cut smoothly. Because I'm cutting through 4 layers, it shouldn't be very difficult. If it's hard, then reduce the layers. I have my first strip. I'm trying not to unsettle the layers too much because I'm going to be cutting these together again in a minute. I'm now going to line up my ruler on the edge of that last cut, and then I'm going to cut my next strip. Keep moving your fabric along so you're working in an area where you feel comfortable. Again, I'm using the markings on my ruler to line up the edge of the fabric and then cut a clean 5-inch strip. You can of course use different dimensions. It depends on the project you're working on. Another thing to consider with a rotary cutter is that when you are pressing the rotary cutter against the ruler, it has a tendency to knock out and slip and slide. So it's really important that once you've lined up your ruler, that you apply an even pressure across the ruler. You can lean forward and use your body weight and your arm and put your elbow down, or you can just spread your fingers out wide on the ruler. I like to use my hand and then go up with the ruler as I go, keeping an eye on all the markings, making sure everything's lined up. Now that I've come to the end of the fat quarters, I have got 4 5-inch strips. I'm also left over with a small piece that is probably just under 2 inches. that's a useful piece of fabric that can be used on a different project, and I like to keep those pieces, and I have a basket for those. Next, I want to be cutting the strips in the other direction, so I create my patchwork squares. I'm lining up my strip here on the mat. There are still 4 layers here, so I want to make sure I'm not going to be accidentally cutting a layer that is a bit too short. So I roll back one of the ends, look for the shortest piece, and make sure that it's covering the markings on the mat, so I don't end up with an odd piece. You can rearrange the strips to make them all match roughly at the same end if you want to. I'm going to be using a smaller ruler here. You can use your bigger ruler, that's absolutely fine, but I just find it easier to handle. First, I need to make sure I've got a nice straight end, and I've got very little waste because I've lined it up. Next, I'm going to count along 5 squares, and I'm going to cut my 5-inch square. Lots of people wonder which side of the thickness of the line to go by. I would say just be consistent, just pick a side. Some of the lines on my cutting mat are slightly thicker than others. Just pick one and you should be fine. Remember, you're going to have a seam allowance as well that is quite forgiving for lining up certain patchwork projects. I'm left over with a piece that is shorter than 5 inches, but really very usable. So I'm going to put this aside, and I'm going to cut these into smaller patchwork squares at a later date. From that one strip, I've got 3 5-inch squares, and because they were layered up 4 times, that means I've got 12 5-inch squares already cut. Another time-saving way of cutting your squares is to take 2 strips and line them up on your cutting mat next to each other. I like to leave a 1-inch gap between them, that way I can see the markings on the mat. Just take some time to make sure everything's lined up, and then use your longer quilting ruler to cut off the ends. I then work down the 2 strips, cutting out my 5-inch squares. Keep working along the strips and you'll have a few offcuts at the end. You're then going to be left with 6 5-inch squares. From each fat quarter I was able to cut 12 squares, and so in a 15 fat quarter bundle that's 180 squares, plenty for any quilt project you're working on. I also ended up with 60 4-inch squares to use on a smaller project. I hope you found this helpful and happy making with whatever you're doing.